Before the video starts, please like, subscribe, and comment.
Most rabbit holes on YouTube are disturbing internet rabbit holes, creepy videos, weird websites, things you weren't supposed to find. But some of the most interesting rabbit holes aren't disturbing because they're scary, they're disturbing because they change how you see a story. Danganronpa is full of those. Characters everyone hates, characters who survive when they shouldn't, characters who die before they ever get a chance to grow, and somehow, the fandom decides who mattered and who didn't. So today, we're going down some Danganronpa rabbit holes, the kind that make you rethink characters you thought you understood. Chapter 1: Survivors Who Shouldn't Have Survived. Whenever you hear this topic come up, you'll see these three, Yasuhiro, Kazuchi, and Himiko. And it's not because they're villains or actively bad, it's because their survival makes you question the story itself. Whenever you look at Yasuhiro's survival, it's hard not to notice how passive he is. He barely contributes to the trials, panics constantly, and rarely drives the story forward.
Strike him with that katana!
No, that was used in self-defense.
Which makes you wonder why he's still around while characters with real arcs die. From a narrative perspective, he's safe, low threat, low drama, low narrative cost. Psychologically, audiences tend to notice growth and stakes more than mere presence, so leaving someone like Yasuhiro alive creates this strange tension. He's there, but emotionally flat, and we remember him more for how his survival highlights the story's choices than for his actual actions. And honestly, if we're being real, it's kind of frustrating to see him survive while others who actually shape the story are cut. Kazuchi's survival is a little different. Unlike Hiro, he actually contributes. He helps with investigations, shows moments of courage, and even drives small parts of the story forward. But at the same time, he's reduced to one obsessive trait for most of the game, and his growth is minimal. From a narrative perspective, Kazuchi survives because he's useful without being threatening. He can influence events without destabilizing the story. Psychologically, viewers notice that he does something, but it's never enough to make his survival feel fully earned compared to characters who die after meaningful arcs. And honestly, even though he contributes more than others, it can still be frustrating to see him stick around when characters with bigger thematic weight or more developed personalities are cut. And then there's Himiko. She contributes almost nothing to the trials, spends most of the game panicking or hiding, and rarely drives the story forward. From a narrative standpoint, she's harmless. She doesn't create conflict, she doesn't challenge the group, and she's easy for the story to keep alive. Psychologically, audiences notice her lack of agency and growth, which makes her survival feel confusing compared to characters who die after shaping the game or showing real development. And yeah, if we're being honest, it's maddening to watch. She survives while others who actually matter get cut, highlighting a strange pattern in who Danganronpa chooses to protect and who it sacrifices. Chapter 2: Why Certain Characters Are Hated, and Why It's Complicated. When people talk about hated Danganronpa characters, the conversation is usually really simple. They're annoying, they're cruel, or they're badly written, end of discussion. But the more you actually look at it, the more complicated that gets. Because the characters people hate the most aren't always the ones who do the worst things. They're usually the ones whose traits trigger stronger emotional reactions. And once that reaction sets in, it's almost impossible for the fandom to let it go. Starting with Hyoko, Hyoko is one of the most hated characters in the series, and psychologically, that reaction isn't random. People tend to respond more harshly to characters who are openly cruel without immediately offering emotional vulnerability, because the audience doesn't get an early reason to sympathize with them. Hyoko's bullying is constant, loud, and often played for discomfort rather than humor, while her trauma is subtle and easy to miss. Psychologically, viewers are more forgiving when pain is shown before cruelty, not after it. Since Hyoko dies before the story seriously reframes her behavior, the audience is left with her worst traits and no closure, which locks the hatred in place. Teru is hated almost instantly, and in this case, the reaction makes complete sense psychologically. People are hardwired to reject individuals who cross sexual or personal boundaries, because that behavior triggers discomfort and even threat responses. Teru is introduced almost entirely through boundary-violating jokes, which means the audience associates him with unease before anything else. Angie, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. Angie's hatred works differently. She isn't hated for being loud or gross. She's hated because she represents control through belief. Psychologically, characters who display absolute moral certainty trigger resistance, especially when they remove individual choice under the guise of guidance or faith. Angie doesn't force people to follow her, she convinces them, which feels more manipulative and unsettling. Audiences tend to react more negatively to characters who exert influence through ideology rather than physical power, because it mirrors real-world experiences with coercion. Even when Angie isn't actively harming anyone, the sense that she decides what's right makes people deeply uncomfortable. Chapter 3: Characters who died before their arc even started. One of the most frustrating patterns in Danganronpa is how often characters die before their arc ever really begins. Not after they change, not after they're understood, but right as the story hints that something deeper is there. When that happens, a character's worst traits become their legacy, because death freezes them exactly where they stood. And unlike survivors, they never get the time needed to reframe who they were supposed to be. Mondo is a textbook example of a character whose arc dies before it ever stabilizes. The story sets him up with clear internal conflict, guilt, anger, masculinity, and fear of vulnerability, and then kills him right as those cracks start to show. Psychologically, audiences tend to remember characters based on their final emotional state, not their trajectory, which means Mondo gets frozen as the angry guy rather than someone actively confronting his own flaws. His death doesn't resolve his conflict, it interrupts it. And because he never gets the time to exist beyond that explosion of emotion, his growth is something viewers have to infer instead of witness. Sayaka dies so early that the audience barely has time to understand what the story is doing with her. She's introduced as kind, supportive, and emotionally close to the protagonist, and then immediately framed through betrayal and desperation. Psychologically, first impressions mixed with moral ambiguity tend to stick harder than later context, especially when there's no follow-up. Because Sayaka dies before her fear, pressure, and lack of options can be fully explored, she's remembered less as a scared teenager and more as a symbol of deception. Her death locks her into controversy rather than complexity. Hyoko's death is especially frustrating because it happens mid-change. For once, the story begins to soften her edges. She's less cruel, more cooperative, and visibly affected by loss, and then she's gone. Psychologically, audiences are more forgiving when growth is completed, not when it's interrupted. Because Hyoko dies before her behavior can be fully reframed, the audience is left debating whether her improvement counts at all. Her death doesn't challenge her reputation, it freezes it, turning potential development into a hypothetical instead of a lived arc. Chapter 4: When the fandom decides a character's worth. At a certain point, a character's reputation stops being shaped by the game and starts being shaped by the fandom. Interpretations get repeated, simplified, and agreed upon until they stop being opinions and start being treated like facts. And once that happens, a character's actual writing matters less than the version everyone collectively decided on. You can genuinely say this for every character in Danganronpa, but there's two that stick out the most for me. Makuro is one of the clearest examples of a character whose worth is inflated almost entirely outside the source material. In the main game, she's distant, emotionally stunted, and largely defined by obedience and repression. But because the game leaves so many gaps, the fandom fills them, often turning Makuro into a tragic, misunderstood badass with hidden depth that the text barely supports. Over time, that fan-constructed version becomes more familiar than the canon one, and Makuro's worth shifts from a minor, controlled character to something far larger than what the story actually shows. Mahiru's situation works in the opposite direction. Her worth isn't exaggerated, it's quietly dismissed. She's one of the most grounded and reasonable characters in the cast, but because she enforces boundaries and calls out behavior, she gets labeled as bitchy or annoying. Psychologically, audiences tend to dislike norm enforcers, especially in chaotic stories, because they interrupt escapism and force accountability. As a result, Mahiru's empathy, practicality, and emotional intelligence get overlooked, and her reputation becomes defined by tone rather than intention. The fandom doesn't erase her character, it reduces her. Chapter 5: Characters forced into one trait forever. Some characters in Danganronpa aren't remembered for who they are, they're remembered for one thing. One trait, one stereotype, one label. And once that label sticks, everything else about them gets ignored. Kiyotaka is the poster child for this phenomenon. Introduced as the ultimate rule follower and strict disciplinarian, audiences immediately lock onto that single trait. Even when the story shows moments of doubt, care, or vulnerability, those glimpses are almost always ignored. People simplify others into memorable categories, and Kiyotaka's rigidity is easy to pigeonhole. No matter how much he grows, he will always be remembered as the strict guy. Sakura is the opposite side of the coin. Everyone remembers her as a muscle monster, or the strongest girl, but that label hides her nuance. She's loyal, thoughtful, and deeply reflective, often questioning herself and her choices. Yet fandom discussions almost never acknowledge this. Psychologically, viewers latch onto the most striking visual or personality trait, and because her strength is so obvious, everything else is minimized. Kaido from V3 is a perfect modern example of one-trait typecasting. The fandom remembers him as the loud, optimistic space boy, and almost everything else about him gets reduced to that meme. His leadership, fear, insecurity, and deeper moments of growth are often ignored. Surprisingly, people simplify characters who are high energy or exaggerated, because it's easier to remember and repeat a single, striking trait. The result is that Kaido becomes more of a symbol than a person, exactly what this chapter is about. And maybe that's the saddest part. Not that these characters were badly written, but that being simplified is the price they pay for being remembered at all.
水で水面し構想目が神殿に今日は